In November 2021, Glasgow hosted the COP26 Environmental Summit. And when Glasgow invites the world round for tea, there's only one place to hold the party: Kelvingrove Art Gallery and Museum. Kelvingrove is Glasgow's treasure palace, home to an extraordinary array of art and artefacts from across the world and across time. I'm Lachlan Goudie. I'm an artist, and I grew up here in Glasgow. Kelvingrove is a place I've returned to all my life to look, to learn, and to wonder. It's Glasgow's most important cultural institution. For me, though, when I was a child, this was only ever the art galleries, and I loved it. And I wasn't alone, because Kelvingrove is the most visited museum in the UK outside London. And for many Glaswegians, there's a real sense that this place is our front room where the family heirlooms that belong to us all are put on display. This building had a huge influence on my life. It was the single most important building in helping shape my ambition to become a painter. So in many ways, it's a building whose art made me. There are many treasure vaults in Glasgow, and this one belongs to me. It's where I keep the work of my father, the painter Lachlan Goudie, and some of my own early drawings. For over a century, Glasgow museums have held an annual art competition. And every year, from about the age of 12, I entered it. Somewhere in all this, I think, are my prize-winning drawings. Where would they be? Ooh. Oh, I forgot about this one. Kelvingrove entrance hall. What does it say? Lachlan Goudie, age 14. It's not very good for 14, Lachlan, honestly. Ooh! Now here's one of Kelvingrove's biggest stars. Dun, dun, dun. Sir Roger. Sir Roger, looking good. I think I won a medal for this one. Well, at least I should have, because it's a really good drawing. I'm still quite pleased with that. I think that my dad and I went to Kelvingrove together to choose what I was going to draw that year for the art competition. My dad was an artist, and he taught me a huge amount. And we used to go to the art galleries together, not regularly, but every so often. And it was in the art galleries that he introduced me to many of his favourite paintings and artworks that had been formative when he was a young art student. And somewhere in here is a painting by my dad of the two of us in front of Kelvingrove. Aha! Oh! My dad liked to paint on a small scale. Oh! Oh, okay. So, here we go. And I remember when Dad painted this, he did my portrait of me in the studio in about 20 minutes. And it was one of the first times that I realised quite what an extraordinarily capable artist he was. I was so jealous. He got me. Boom. Just like that. This painting was a tribute to Kelvingrove and the important role it played in both our lives. In 1901, Glasgow hosted another global event,
an international exhibition that celebrated the city's industrial power. The newly built Kelvingrove was to be its centrepiece. At its opening, the Lord Provost described it as a palace of dreams.
There's no other museum in Britain that looks quite like it, and I always have the sense that somewhere there's a wind-up key that would set the whole thing in motion. There are two things that any Glaswegian will tell you about Kelvingrove. And the first is a bonkers myth that the whole building was constructed back to front, and nobody realised until the architects turned up to inspect the finished museum. The second thing, though, is real. And that's that inside Kelvingrove Art Gallery and Museum has a very distinctive perfume. Smell that. You know, in the 40-odd years I've been coming here, it just hasn't changed. It's a mixture of varnish, brasso, bit shortbread, and just a hint of that musty smell you get at the back of an old wardrobe. It's wonderful.
And another thing that hasn't changed at all is the subject of my favourite drawing, still standing exactly where I left him.
Meet Sir Roger the Elephant, my old friend. I like to think of him as a bit of a leathery old grandad that we've all been visiting since around about 1902 when the museum opened. And I promise you, if you treated your grandad the way the world treated Roger here, well, you'd get in a lot of trouble.
Not much is known about his early years, but by the 1890s he was in captivity, touring the UK in Bostock and Womwell's travelling menagerie.
And then, in May 1897, he came to live in a zoo in Glasgow's Cowcaddens. I can't imagine he was very impressed. And after 3 years of Glasgow's rather less than tropical climate, poor old Roger here got, well, understandably perhaps, a little bit grumpy. And the zookeeper then took what to us is an astonishing decision. He decided to hire a firing squad to do away with Roger. And then he sold tickets to the execution. Apparently, you can still see one of the bullet holes in him.
As a boy, it wasn't just Roger that fired my imagination. The art collection here at Kelvingrove was built on old master paintings donated to the city by wealthy Glasgow merchants and industrialists.
This is Rembrandt's Man in Armour, possibly the most valuable artwork in the collection at Kelvingrove. It's certainly my favourite. It was painted around 1655, but I first got to meet this chap 325 years later when I was a boy in the 1980s. And it really is the first work of art by anyone other than my dad that I felt inexorably drawn towards. I remember how in my dad's studio in the evening when my parents were watching TV, I used to dress myself up in velvet cloaks and draw portraits of myself, trying to channel the spirit of this great painting, the dramatic lighting and the sort of moody stare. And ever since that very first encounter, I've spent my entire life desperately trying to learn how one could paint like this. Rembrandt was in the habit, actually, of starting his images not by painting the whole canvas white, but brown. And it's part of the secret behind the sort of rich, smoky quality of so many of his greatest paintings that every image starts in darkness. And Rembrandt works around this. He deepens some shadows, and then he would start to introduce increasingly lighter layers of colour, just like he was pulling a ghost off the surface of the canvas.
Rembrandt's Man in Armour was painted late in his career, when he was going bankrupt. His collection of armour was about to be sold off. Today, Kelvingrove has one of the most important collections of armour in the world. Rembrandt would have loved it here. I certainly did as a schoolboy. War, conflict and heroism have always been a favourite subject for artists. And I remember as a boy the thrill of encountering paintings at Kelvingrove that represented Scottish heroes and brave Highlanders. But as an adult, I find it striking how often iconic Scottish paintings illustrate a narrative of tragedy and defeat in the face of unbeatable odds. The massacre at Glencoe and the last of the clan reinforce stereotypes of brave Highlanders, loss and heroism that became fundamental to a 19th century idea of Scotland. In the neighbouring gallery is an unassuming exhibit that tells a very different story about Scotland's past.
Situated in such a grand gallery, surrounded by objects and artefacts of global significance, you'd be forgiven for walking past. But this piece of folded fabric sitting quietly at the bottom of this cabinet is actually a pair of silk women's trousers, and the catalogue entry describes it as loot from Lucknow.
In 1857, Indian soldiers in the city of Lucknow rebelled against their British commanders. Highland regiments were sent in, led by a Glaswegian, Sir Colin Campbell, to violently quash the uprising.
This is a trophy of war, perhaps grabbed by Highland troops, those kinds of men who were portrayed in art and literature at the time as brave and dignified warriors. We don't know who these trousers belong to, but whether the owner was alive or dead, their presence here in this gallery really is as much of a Scottish tragedy as those scenes depicted by those stirring Victorian paintings.
One of the challenges for a museum like Kelvingrove is to find ways to face up to some of the more difficult aspects of our nation's history. Coming back to the museum in adulthood, there are some things I see differently.
This is a very dull portrait of a very rich man. His name was Arthur Connell, and he was a pillar of the establishment. He was a magistrate and the Lord Provost of Glasgow between 1772 and 1774. And Arthur looks like a decent enough chap, doesn't he? I can almost imagine him sitting in the front pew at church on a Sunday morning. But the fact is that Arthur's respected status and his wealth had a great deal to do with an object exhibited in the neighbouring cabinet, and that, and the story behind it, is anything but decent or worthy of our respect.
It's a copper coin minted in 1788 for the owner of a plantation in Barbados, at a time when the African slave trade was a major source of labour on sugar plantations in the Caribbean.
This side of it looks cheerful enough. It's a decorative pineapple. But what you can't see is that on the other side, there's the representation of an African slave wearing a crown and feathered plumes. And written underneath that are the words, "I serve." It's obscene, really. And this coin was a product of a society for whom human life was equivalent to coins like these. Human life was seen as a commodity. It could be traded. Life was currency, and life was cheap. In one way or another, coins like this helped to fill Arthur Connell's pockets, because Arthur was a wealthy sugar merchant, and his elegant clothes and the Glasgow mansion that he lived in were paid for using money earned from slave labour. So the story that lies behind this painting really, for me, transforms a pretty unremarkable portrait into a hugely important historical artefact, because this painting allows us to look history in the eye, to meet someone who enabled and profited from slavery, and to accuse them, really, of being complicit. I don't think we should hide images like this away, sculptures, paintings that represent problematic moments from our past. I really do think that we should confront them.
The relationship between art, wealth and power has always been a complicated one. Glasgow's journey towards the 1901 International Exhibition and the opening of this great museum was driven by coal money and steel money, and money earned through the tobacco and sugar trades. Art can play a powerful role in the way we imagine our past, but sometimes the picture of history that artists paint can be deceptive.
There's no other painting in Kelvingrove that tells a bigger fib than this one. Vincent van Gogh's flame-red hair and staring green eyes have come to embody what we think a volatile and bohemian artist should look like, possibly because he painted over 35 extraordinary self-portraits in his lifetime. And until 1928, this was thought to be one of them. But it isn't. This is a portrait of Vincent's flatmate. His name was Alex Reid, and he was a Ouija. That's a Glaswegian, by the way.
Reid was an art dealer who came to Paris in 1886 and worked with Theo van Gogh, Vincent's brother. Together, they lived in an apartment in Montmartre, which is where this portrait was painted.
This portrait was probably painted very quickly on a piece of cardboard, the outline drawn directly in paint, and the colour kind of stabbed onto the surface using a very thin and stiff brush. But Vincent van Gogh wasn't some kind of wild, impetuous painting fiend. No, when you get close up to this painting, you can see an artist really thinking forensically about how to use colour. And he thought a great deal and was heavily influenced by contemporary theories on that subject. So you can see in this painting how he strategically places a whole range of reds and greens alongside each other. Colours which, technically speaking, really get on each other's nerves. They fight for attention. Those little stabbing marks that cover the whole painting create a kind of visual rhythm and energy that seems to bring this painting to life. And even though the way that Van Gogh is using paint is an abstraction, it gives me an even more convincing sense that there's a living, breathing human being lying underneath all this mark making.
In the portrait, Alex Reid looks like a rather wily fox. And back in Glasgow in 1889, he set up a gallery. For the first time, paintings by Degas, Monet, Renoir and Pissarro, all the artists Alex had hung out with in Paris, started appearing on the walls of Scottish mansions. It's because of Van Gogh's flatmate and the bequests of his millionaire clients that Kelvingrove now owns one of the most significant collections of French 19th century art in all of Europe. It was the fantastic Mr. Reid who helped create a Scottish art supergroup. Samuel John Peploe, John Duncan Ferguson, F.C.B. Cadell and Leslie Hunter. 4 painters inspired by the French avant-garde. They would become known as the Scottish colourists.
But J.D. Ferguson was, in my opinion, the most exciting painter of them all. And here we've got 2 portraits that were painted within a year of each other. The first is of an American artist named Anne Estelle Rice.
The subdued colours, the buttery handling of the paint, and the bold use of black were distinctive features of Ferguson's style at the time.
But this is what happens when you spend a few months in Paris in 1907 hanging out with the fauves, the wild boys of the French avant-garde like Matisse and Derain. This is a portrait of Bertha Case, another young artist who J.D. Ferguson used to lounge around with in the cafes of Montparnasse. But unlike the earlier portrait, we can see here that J.D. Ferguson is doing everything he can to break apart the illusion of a nice harmonious composition. So you've got these furious areas of rapid brushwork, you've got broken outlines, you've got a real sense that J.D. Ferguson wants you to think things are falling apart. Here is a figure that's in movement. The fauves built on Van Gogh's achievements. They searched for pure colour in unexpected places to create a kind of alternative, heightened version of reality.
Ferguson was the first British artist to reinterpret the innovations of French fauvism in his own work. This was radical. And even in the 1950s, when Kelvingrove acquired this canvas, it challenged many people's idea of what a painting should look like. It's perhaps surprising, however, that the artwork that has caused the greatest commotion at Kelvingrove isn't some wild experiment with fauvist colour. It was this. Salvador Dali's Christ of St. John of the Cross drew angry public protest when it was acquired by the city of Glasgow in the 1950s because of its huge price tag. But it's become the most famous and most reproduced painting in the Kelvingrove collection.
I recently overheard a fellow Glaswegian telling his son, Dali was a proper nutter, so he was. But by Dali's standards, this really isn't a painting that sets out to shock. There are no dripping clocks or elephants with spindly legs. The surrealism is really subtle. Christ's hands aren't nailed down. They appeared to be magnetised weirdly to the crossbeam. And yet, the scrunched up appearance of those fingers conveys a real sense of profound agony. And the landscape at the bottom of the painting isn't the Holy Land, it's Port Ligat on the Spanish coast where Dali actually lived. But the biggest mind-bender, I think, in this whole painting is that we are looking at Jesus from his dad's perspective. We're plunging down into this subject. This is a God's eye view.
People have been painting crucifixion scenes for centuries, and yet Dali's composition appears to achieve the impossible. He finds a way for us to re-see one of the most reproduced moments in art history. There are so many things in this museum that make us re-see the world in startling new ways. And there is one final artist in the Kelvingrove collection whose work has this effect on me. Images, again, of suffering from an unexpected perspective, from the concentration camps of World War II.
Marion Grant was 17 years old, turning on 18 when World War II began. And I don't know what you were doing when you were 17 or in your early 20s, but you know, you were not a witness to, in all likelihood, anything as awful and apocalyptic and beyond the human imagination as the scenes that she came to draw and sketch in her young years.
These watercolours were painted in Bergen-Belsen in 1945. The artist was a young Jewish woman from Prague who had spent much of the war imprisoned in forced labour camps and at Auschwitz.
Marion Grant sketched and documented scenes of cruelty that were part of her daily life. She was drawing people who had ambitions and ideas about how their lives were going to be spent. And not one of them imagined that their precious time on this earth would be finished, ended, terminated in an interwoven pile of carcasses, because that's the word, and that's what this documents. It is the dehumanization of our fellow man and woman into a ragged lump of bones and flesh. And she has objectively selected her palette of blues and crimsons and ochres and yellows, in the same way that we saw Rembrandt work his palette, in the same way we saw Van Gogh think about his colours. Marion Grant is an artist trying to translate what she could see into colours that our eyes would receive, and in the process alert our brains to understand what at first sight we can't really comprehend. These images are of phenomenal art historical importance. Rembrandt, Goya, all the greats, these sit alongside those artists in their ability to communicate something very, very, very profound about a human experience to the viewer. It's shocking. It is a powerful witness of a story that we all think is very, very far away. Kelvingrove is a place where many complicated stories come together, where history and the imagination meet.
In museums like this, the past becomes a very immediate experience. These exhibits can inspire us, change the way we look at the world, or even remind us of things we might otherwise choose to forget.
This building, the art and artefacts contained here have an enormous power, a power to impact us in that first encounter, but also to reverberate across history and to shape our future.
For me, that is the wonder of Glasgow's Treasure Palace.